this young man has pled not guilty. That means you have to presume him innocent. That means that that presumption stays with him until and if the state of Florida can prove their case beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. The judge goes on to tell you, and it's in your packet of jury instructions, that the defendant, Ynw Melly, is not required to present any evidence or prove anything. So it's nice that they're interpreting these things, but the bottom line is they don't even know. Because they've given you just two alternatives. Either he's the shooter or the principal. Make up your mind. Tell these folks what it is. Now, how do you go about doing this? Well, the judge gave you an instruction on that. You're to look at the evidence that's been presented to you. Remembering, we don't have to do a thing. All we have to do is show up and behave. Now, I don't know if I behaved totally correct during the course of this trial. So, on behalf of us, let me apologize if I have or we have offended any of you. And I would ask you, I would plead with you, if I or any of the other individuals have done anything to irritate you, don't take it out on this young man. Still hold the burden of proof to this table. Now, why do they have the burden of proof? Because they are the state. They are the government. As we learned in this case, they have the police department of Miramar. They have the Broward Sheriff's Office. They have the DNA labs. They have experts, the FBI. They have everything at their disposal. And that's why our system of justice is different than anyone else in the world. We recognized a long time ago that when the government accuses somebody of a crime, they have the money, the resources, and the person power to attempt to prove to you all that a person has committed a crime beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. Now, how do you go about doing it? And before I get into that, first of all, let me also thank you, because we have interrupted your lives for, it seems like, months. And we have put a horrible burden on your personal lives, your family life, and what have you. And all of us applaud and thank you for your service. You folks have gone way beyond the call of duty. And I think we all recognize that. But how do we go about determining, and I shouldn't say how do you folks go about determining if the state of Florida has proved their case beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt? Well, the judge just gave you that instruction. It is to the evidence introduced in this trial and to it alone that you are to look for that proof. Remembering, we just got to show up. And how does a reasonable doubt occur? Well, the judge has told you. It can come from the evidence itself, a conflict in the evidence, or a lack of evidence. You don't need all three of these areas. But I suggest to you folks that we have a reasonable doubt from the evidence that has been presented, that there is a conflict in the evidence, and there's a lack of evidence. This is an unusual case, kind of like the medical examiners. The two medical examiners said it's unusual because normally you can't tell what shot occurred first, second, or third, And the chief medical examiner came in here, Dr. McDougall, I think, and told you it's only happened to her in her entire career, I think 2 or 3 times, that she could tell you which shot occurred first in this case. So, knowing that, let's look at what the state presented. But before we do that, we can agree upon a couple of things that are not in dispute. They said that Matt Melly is a talented music artist. We agree with that. At the age of 19, based upon the evidence, he was making more money than probably everybody in this courtroom, including us. Number 2. Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. You okay? Usually, the judge will stop me immediately. Number 2 is that Cortland Henry changed his clothes before he went to the hospital. That's what they said just 10 minutes ago. Number 3, that there is absolutely no eyewitness that will implicate this young man to this crime, these crimes. Number 4, they talk about premeditation. I suggest to you there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever to show premeditation. And the last one that we absolutely agree with, and they admit it, the Miramar Police Department lacks the training. Those aren't my words. That was Miss Bradley just an hour ago saying. Not only did Miss Bradley say that, but Sergeant Williams also said they lacked the training and one of the worst investigations. That's why I pushed aside their reports. Now, the state produced over 100 exhibits. They're sitting right here on the floor. Ms. Bradley made reference to some of them. They're all here. And I put them on this side of the podium because I suggest to you that this is a smoke screen. I suggest to you that this is open for anybody to interpret any way they want. When I say something sarcastic, you don't know if I'm serious or not. I can tell my colleague, I hate your guts, and it could be joking, and I am joking. And that's what this case is, and that's all this evidence is open for interpretation. That's not evidence proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Now I put on this side of the table really the evidence that means something. There's one other exhibit, but it's on a little USB internet thing. And that is the video leaving the studio, showing the 2 cars and the 8 individuals that left. Sitting on this side of the table is the broken cell phone that Moretti could not tell you whose it was, and the 9807 phone that Melly uses, as other people do too. These are the 2 key pieces of evidence. These are what I suggest you focus in on, because you can take any one of these items, any one of these text messages, any one of these pinging on maps, and you still don't know what was said, what was meant, and more importantly, who said it. I leave my phone, and I'm sure you all, in the house, and my wife picks it up and sends a message. And it looks like it's coming from me. And sometimes she sends messages that I'm kind of shocked about. But you don't know. So let's put the 100+ exhibits to the side for a moment. The state called 26 witnesses. I think I counted. And I suggest to you that you should look at 11 witnesses very carefully. And why do I say that? Because when you look at these 11 witnesses, you will find out that there's a conflict in the testimony, that there is a lack of testimony, and the third way is from the testimony itself. The first one that I would like to talk about well, before I talk about the first witness, I want you to remember one thing. On October 26th, that day of the shooting, we learned immediately that that Jeep was taken to a secure area. And it was searched for over 15 hours by 2 crime scene technicians. And you heard how they pulled out the evidence. They got some foam, some projectiles, I think a can, everything, and photographed the vehicle. Now, why is that important? Because that vehicle was searched. Are you okay? You want to take a break? That vehicle was searched again months later. But it didn't stop there. Because about 3 years later, miraculously, even though it was searched for hours by crime scene technicians, Sergeant Williams comes into the scene at the request of the state of Florida, this particular prosecutor right here, and miraculously he finds additional evidence, 2 projectiles and a bloodstain that obviously everyone else missed. That should tell you something about the quality of this investigation. That should give you a clue as to what's going on in this case. What happened was, once they got the surveillance tape of the individuals leaving the studio, they knew that Cortland Henry, Williams, Thomas, and this young man got into the Jeep. It's shown on the video. In the Mitsubishi were Adrian Davis, Patrick DeLoach, Trevon Glass, and I'm missing one other one. Withers, Dontavius Withers. And we know that on October 26th, when Moretti saw that surveillance, Cortland Henry identified all of them. And in fact told them that he lives at this young man's house I made a mistake. Jacoby Mills was in the car. It was Jacoby Mills, Adrian Davis, Trevon Glass, and Dontavius Withers. Okay? I can't keep the names straight. I'm lucky if I can remember my own name. That's why I haven't written it down. We know that Moretti identified all 8 people that left the studio on October 26th. We also know that Moretti knew where this young man lived along with all the other 7 people that left the studio. We all know that, according to the state, Cortland Henry lied to the police. And we also know, as the investigation progressed, that Cortland Henry had blood matching the victim on his clothes. And he also had GSR, or gunshot residue, on his clothes. If that were true, and you saw the pictures of the Jeep, all bloody, blood all over the place, and we learned that you could spray and determine if there was blood right here on the carpet, even though you don't see it, why in the heck don't you get a search warrant for the house? Why in the heck don't you? Don't tell us we didn't know where he lived. Don't tell us it was months later, because they go into the car 4 years later and do this. So why don't you do it? Because Detective Moretti and the Miramar Police Department, as everyone has said, lacks the experience and the training. We don't have to do a darn thing, folks. We don't have to do a thing. But let's go into the 11 witnesses now. The first one, and they mentioned him, George Bello, the manager, the head guy of the gun and tool mark unit of the entire Broward Sheriff's Office. And he tells you, after we get a great education of guns and projectiles and casings, we have to bring out the fact that can you tell or determine the distance between the shooter and the victim? Can you tell us that with all your experience? And what does he say? I can't do it unless I have the weapon, unless I have the ammunition, because ammunition, the weight of ammunition, could change the distance, and you have to have the weapon in order to do that. He cannot even tell us if it was 1 gun, 2 guns, or more. He's honest. He tells you that without the weapon used, I cannot place the shooter to the victim, or victims in this case. Now, why is that important? Because a reasonable doubt can arise from a conflict in the testimony. If you believe George Bello, and I suggest you should, then he totally contradicts all the testimony of Sergeant Williams, who comes in here 4 and 5 years later and says, I can tell you where shooter 1 was, and I can tell you who the shooter is. You talk about a conflict in the testimony? It's one or the other. It can't be both. And he tells you, in addition to that, that the environment has to be considered. Now, Williams tells you he goes out to the scene some 4 or 5 years later and has no idea, nor did he even check the terrain, the environment on that particular morning hour. So you've got to believe one or the other. You can't believe both of them because they are in direct conflict with each other. But let's go further. The next witness that you should consider is FBI agent Brendan Collins. He is an expert in tracking phones. He is not only an expert in Broward County, but he's an expert, and his team have been specially trained to map phones, not only in this country, but anywhere in the world if he's called upon. They brought him in. And what does he tell you? This expert. I cannot determine precisely the location of a phone. I cannot say 100% the phone is in, and you saw the band, it looks like a banana. He says, I think it's somewhere within this area, but I can't be 100% sure. He's candid with you. And he further tells you that the call detail records are limited. And I can't tell you who had the phone at any particular time. And most importantly, he tells you in making the mapping of the phones, the FBI, the special agents, do not use two items that are on the bill. That is the environment section, and he does not map out based upon the longitude and latitude. He goes to the cell towers and where they're bouncing off. And it could vary depending upon the strongest signal or how busy that network is. Well, he contradicts Williams, the one who comes up and tells you the phone is at this location here, this location here, this location here, at these particular times. It's one or the other, folks. I suggest to you there's another conflict in the testimony. The next witness I think you need to pay particular attention to and really get a flavor of what this case is all about is Felicia Holmes. Felicia Holmes tells you that the Miramar detectives, Moretti and his group, threatened her, bullied her daughter, told potential witnesses they were going to prison, told witnesses that they may never see their children again, told a witness that he was going to be deported even though he's been in this country since 5 years old. He was going to be deported to Haiti where they won't feed you. The place is, with all due respect, and excuse my language, but it was his language that he used, shit. This is the great detective. This is why this kid's sitting here. They have intimidated and threatened everybody. So I ask you, I beg you, to consider Felicia Holmes, because that tells you what's going on. When Moretti got that surveillance tape and realized this young man, this little kid, excuse me for calling him a kid, he was 19 at the time, was a rap star, making more money than he'll ever see in his entire career at 19. He got tunnel vision. And he wanted to nail this kid. And what better way to move up the ranks, get some publicity, is to arrest the star. If they arrest Howard or myself, they go, who the hell is Addleston? Who the hell is Howard? That's the bottom line. So he just focused in, and everything was directed to get this kid. That's why he ignored everything. And that's why he intimidated and threatened anybody that said something different. So I ask you to pay attention to Felicia Holmes, because you do get an idea of what this investigation is. The fourth witness was a Kurt Rhodes, the DNA expert. Now, why is he important? Because while we were picking a jury in April and we were off in May, this prosecutor asked him to go back to the car and check some DNA. Now, why would you do that? The case, according to Moretti, is closed as soon as this young man is arrested. Why do you go back 5 years and ask an expert, a DNA expert, to do some more testing? This kid walked into the Broward, voluntarily surrendered. And 5 years later, they had the audacity to say, do a little more testing. Why? Because now we're in trial. And they realize there's problems with the case. Why else would you do it? Three years after this young man surrenders, they bring in Danny Polo. I call him the masked man. He came in here for a few hours, if you recall, got on this witness stand and wore a ski mask over his entire face where you could only see his eyes. They came in here. He got involved in 2022 at the request, again, of the state, the prosecutor. What was the purpose of that? The great gang expert? They wanted to link him to some gang. You know, in the rap culture, whether you want to accept it or not, gangs are attracted to it. If you want to be successful in rap music, you are going to pick up some of the nuances of various gangs. Snoop Dogg, to this day, it was. Oh, all right.
No problem. Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is an argument. All right, just proceed, counsel. Judgment is overruled.
Snoop Dogg, to this day, does hand signs of a gang. And he does that because he realizes it promotes his music. That's the bottom line. And because he wants to promote his music, make money, he's all of a sudden this big gang guy. And they wait till 2022 to bring him in. I thought the case was closed, according to Moretti. And they show you some text messages from, I think it was Gino Herc and Quando Wando, who fought with Anthony Williams previously. Now, certainly, if the investigation is being fair and you want to find who was involved in this case, you would relay that information to the lead detective of people of interest or suspects. And what do we find out? Moretti has no idea who Gino is, no idea who Herc is, and doesn't know about Quando Wando. This is a great investigation. But he also refers to some text messages where those individuals that are in fact associated with the gang text him and he's not responding. and to the point of not responding, they say they're going to put you on the plate. Now that's not for dinner. That's not for breakfast. We learned what that means. If you don't start responding to us, we're going to have you killed. What the heck's going on? Why wouldn't you investigate this? They want you to believe that there's no evidence of that. How do they know there's no evidence if they don't investigate? They don't search. They don't look. You got all these phones. Get Gino and Herc. You have their text messages. Go get their phones. Track them and see. We don't have to do a thing, folks. The presumption of innocence stays with us during the entire trial until and if they can prove beyond every reasonable doubt that this young man did anything wrong. Moretti didn't want to look at that. Why? Because God forbid they find some evidence. His arrest of a star is down the tubes. That's the bottom line. I want you to pay particular attention to Dr. McDougall and Dr. Saunders. Because those two doctors, one being the chief medical examiner of Broward County, the other one, an associate medical examiner, I think now employed in West Palm Beach, say to you that the first shot to Williams and Thomas were fatal. Deadly. Why is that important? Because according to Sergeant Williams, Thomas's injury to his hand came first. It was a defensive wound. We know that couldn't happen based upon the medical testimony. So you either have to disregard the medical examiner and accept what Williams' testimony is, or I suggest, now that you have four experts contradicting Williams' testimony, and that is Bello, Special Agent, FBI Agent Collins, and two medical examiners conflict with Williams' testimony, that you should take Williams' testimony and ignore it, toss it out. You can't have it both ways. It just doesn't work. And then we get to really their star witness, two star witnesses. Sergeant Williams. And I think I've talked a bit about him. And I think the most amazing part of his testimony is that he does not get involved in this case until 3 years after the incident. Again, at the request of the state. Again, because they realize they have problems. And I applaud them to recognize they have problems. And miraculously, as I told you earlier, even though the Jeep was searched for hours and hours, processed for hours and hours, he finds additional evidence. 2 projectiles that everyone else missed, and a blood stain that is important. And that when he did his analysis, 2 important things occurred. He didn't go in there blindly to do any analysis. He told you that the prosecutors in this case told them that the defendant in this case was this young man. And we need you to do a trajectory analysis to put him on the scene. Now, I suggest to you, you could have a Jolly Green Giant and a midget. And if you give them the dimensions, the height and his arm length, with this mathematical formula, you could say the Jolly Green Giant or the midget was a shooter in this case. They would either be closer to the car or further from the car, depending upon their size. If you want to do an analysis, if you want to do an investigation, if you want to figure out who the shooter is, why do you point to this kid and tell him, this is what we want? Why do you do that? This is the great investigation. This is what they want you to do in order to render a verdict that could take him.
Your suggestion.
Properly signed.
Over, proceed.
And tell him that he's going to live life in the state penitentiary without parole or being on death row. This is the investigation they want you to rely upon and say it's proof beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt? I guess so, according to them. And they call Danny Benitez. Who the heck is he? He was on the stand for all of about 2 minutes. Danny Benitez gave Detective Moretti the surveillance tape from the Montessori school. You watched it. It showed, I suggest, nothing probative to implicate this young man in it. But we learned, not from him, but from Moretti, that he doesn't go to the drugstore on Miramar Parkway to check their surveillance tape. He doesn't go to Applebee's to check their surveillance tape. He doesn't go to Polo Tropical or the gas station or the bank on Miramar Parkway to check their surveillance tapes. When the car's on 184th Avenue, he doesn't go to the fire station to check their tapes, surveillance tapes. Doesn't go back to the 2 elementary schools, Sunset Lakes and West Broward Elementary, to check their surveillance tape, because he knows it all. He knows it. How do you know it if you don't check? How do you know something unless you investigate? We don't have to do a thing, folks. We don't have to do anything except show up. And begrudgingly, we did. Where the Montessori school was, on Pines, there was a tractor supply company and another school. Why don't you get that? And come in here and say, you know what, folks? We checked all of this. Instead, what they do is take a helicopter ride 4 or 5 years later. And we have to sit here and watch as they fly the route. And we have to watch how they drive the route. Not checking what the traffic conditions were that day, back 4 or 5 years ago. Not checking what the weather was 5 years ago in October 26th. What's the purpose of that? Just to add more of what I suggest is a smokescreen. You look at all this and say, heck, man, 100 exhibits, 500 photographs out of a cell phone, all these text messages. What does it mean? Hopefully, for the state, you'll say, hey, where there's smoke, there must be 5. And say, hey, too bad, young man, too bad. There's a lot of stuff sitting here. And hopefully you will not fall into that trap. And then we get to the lead detective. Well, before we get to the lead detective, I think I missed someone. Trevion Glass, the individual who got into the red Mitsubishi. The man who is convicted of 2 felonies. Now, why is that important? Because the judge read you an instruction on some of the factors to look at in determining whether or not to believe a witness or not. And he told you that one of the factors to look at is whether or not the witness has been convicted of a crime. Trevion Glass, the state calls, as their star witness, basically, to say Melly never got into that red Mitsubishi. And he told you one interesting thing. He said he's got a case pending right now, and he doesn't want to go back to jail. Now, who has the authority to put him in jail? We don't. There's only one person who can put him back in jail. And that's the state of Florida, whether it be through the state attorney's office or the police department. And he miraculously is the only witness that says no one got into the red Mitsubishi from the recording studio. But he tells you, doesn't tell you how he gets into Melly's house. Because he doesn't have a key. So, what's going on here? What's the story here? And then they call the star witness, the lead detective, Detective Moretti. We know he doesn't look at the surveillance tapes on the various Miramar Parkway and Pines and what have you, because he knows. He's worked the area. He knows that he got 9807, the phone that Melly has used, and you've seen various and a lot of photographs. I think it's Exhibit 115, am I correct? 100, excuse me, 100. And who did they get this phone from? Detective Moretti? Jameson Francois. And certainly you asked him, how long have you had this phone? And he says, I never asked him. How convenient. And he goes and says there was another phone in the vehicle, but it was broken. That's 115? 115. So I can't tell you whose phone that is. Now, we don't have a burden to do anything. If you recall, we asked him to take out the SIM card of this broken phone. And there was a reason for it, to tell you the quality of the investigation. He took out that SIM card, read the serial number from that SIM card, which he had never done until you saw him open his phone in the courtroom. And he agreed that you can take that serial number to T-Mobile, Sprint, and what have you, and determine whose phone is, who is the owner, subscriber, and get a warrant for that phone. You've got warrants on a lot of phones. Get a warrant on this phone if you want to see what it is. Moretti doesn't want to do that because he's afraid. It'll ruin the investigation. That's why I put these two phones separate and apart from all this other stuff. Now, the state said to you, there was no reason, I think was the exact quote, for the Jeep to stop on the side of the road. I suggest to you that as we have done periodically through this case, the reason was
Objection, facts, not evidence.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, this argument. Proceed, counsel.
the reason was because he needed a bathroom break, just like you and I did when I raised my hand or stand up. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, if he needed a bathroom break, in the dark highway, and you saw him carry it in his hand, he'd leave it on the seat of the car. And we know that the car sped off because there was another car waiting, the red Mitsubishi. You want to know there's no reason? The poor kid had to urinate. And the phone was in the car. But they don't want you to know any of this. That's why we had to call Adrian Davis. But let's stay on Moretti for a little while. Because they execute a search warrant on his house, his apartment, and his storage unit. They find ammunition in there. They find in the storage unit, I think, 3 holsters and gun locks. We don't know what type of guns belong to those holsters. We don't know what type of guns were the gun locks to. All we know is there are 3 guns missing based upon the 3 holsters. And Moretti doesn't even ask where these weapons are. What are these weapons? Should it concern you? Yes. Should it show you a lack of evidence? Yes. Ask yourself. They keep telling you to use your common sense. Use your common sense, please. Ask yourself why a lead detective of a double homicide would not ask Jameson Francois, where the hell are the guns? Where the hell are the locks that belong to the guns? Where are they? I suggest to you when you use your common sense, you're going to say, he doesn't want to know. Because, God forbid, those, or one of those, could be the murder weapon. And then, the investigation of this rap star is down the tubes. reads to you various messages from various people. But he never goes to talk to these people to see what they meant. You search Jameson Francois' car that supposedly is involved in taking Melly, and 4 months later, well, if you go and search his car, Jameson Francois, let's go back again to his house. Get up here, State, and tell them why you didn't search the house. You learn about Frito Bang, supposedly takes him somewhere. Why in the heck don't you search his house? Even if it's 4 months later, 5 months later, 10 months later, and use that fancy spray. Not the one that causes you to get sick, but the new spray. And look for it. What kind of investigation is this when we're talking about putting a young kid on death row or life without parole? Or any investigation? This is no game, folks. We're playing for all the marbles. That's why they said that Miramar Police Department lacks the training. They did absolutely nothing once they got that surveillance tape. Blinders on them. We're not going to look to the left. We're not going to look to the right. We're just going to direct everything to this young man. And I'm glad they admitted the suspects of 13. We know that Cortland Henry's involved. You heard about Crucial Almighty David Hedgepath, who wrote and texted, "We killed 2 of you." And someone said I should use the word ninjas instead of the word that he used. And in that message, he had a target over someone's face. Whose was it? Guess what? It's Melly. And he did it within hours. And what do they do? Nothing. Years later, they get his so-called timesheet where he was working. They don't bother to talk to any of his co-employees to verify this. In fact, if you look at the timesheets, it gives him time to, I think he's up in Verrill and Melbourne, to be exactly in Broward County, which is about 2 to 3 hours before the job. It's no alibi at all. But why don't you talk to these people? Why don't you investigate? How in the hell does he send out a text? "We killed 2 of you. We were aiming at the Jeep." Bentley, who had a problem with Melly, he does nothing. That's not a person of interest. He knows that there is a incident at Walmart where he's robbed of a chain, I think it is. Why don't you get the surveillance tape? Or at least try so you can say, "I tried," and it doesn't exist anymore. Jameson Francois with the missing guns. He's the manager who had, I think, $16 million in his account. If anyone had a motive in this case, it would be Jameson Francois, possibly. I don't know. We don't have to prove a darn thing. Why don't you at least investigate? Why don't you do the work that is required before you ask 12 of you to either put him on death row or life in prison? Jay Green, who had a beef with Melly. Why don't you check him out? Quando Wando, why don't you check him out? Gina, who said he's going to be on a plate. They're going to kill him. Moretti that says, I don't even know who the heck Gino is because no one told me. Herc says you got to communicate with us or you're going to pay the consequences. He doesn't know who Herc is. Goon. Same thing. And then the state rests. They say, folks, we've presented you all the evidence. Well, that wasn't true. Because we had to call Adrian Davis. And you learned that Adrian Davis showed up in the state attorney's office and gave a sworn statement. They never told you this. We did. We don't have to do any of this. And Adrian Davis said, I told you. He got in the car. How do I know that? Because I was woken up when someone was crawling in the back seat. How do I know that? When we got to Melly's house, he's the one who had to open the door. Because only he and Cortland Henry had the key to his house. Why do we have to do that? Why did they conceal that from you? Why did they hide that from you? I can't answer those questions, folks, but I don't have to. Other than to say, reasonable doubt. You know, when we started this journey together, the state promised you that they were going to prove their case beyond the exclusion of every reasonable doubt. They told you that they have accepted the responsibility, that they have the burden of proof. They told you that they would prove each element of this case. What they have proved to you is that Cortland Henry is involved in this case. Who else, if anyone else, you folks don't know from the evidence. They tell you and play you a video where Melly appears in Cocoa Beach that afternoon. Well, as AD told you, there was a contract and people were going to lose a lot of money. And he happens to be at the tender age at that time of 19, a professional. And we all know, and unfortunately, probably a lot of us have had to do something while we are suffering an illness or a death in our family. What does that prove? Absolutely nothing. Other than at the tender age of 19, this kid, I say kid, I shouldn't say that. This man, young adult, is a professional. They say because you didn't show up at 1 or 2 jobs, that what the heck? They have no idea what the contract was. They have no idea how much money was involved. They have absolutely no idea. Why? Because there was no investigation. Play this. And they want you to believe that he's a cold-hearted murderer. When quite to the contrary. You saw the tapes. You saw that he's a nice young man and a professional. Folks, the worst thing any lawyer can do is sit and see a misjustice, no matter what side of the fence you're on. Especially when you're talking about a 23, 24-year-old kid. Man, young adult. To me, he's a kid. Because I have children older than him.
Objection, Your Honor. Sympathy.
Sustained.
The worst thing you can do is sit and see a misjustice. And we have sat here for months, starting in April, waiting to see the evidence. And I suggest to you right now, you should have more questions than when you were selected as jurors as to what really happened. And there was a gentleman who recently said that our system of justice is broken. I don't believe that. But he got on TV and it was all over national news saying, I think our system of justice is broken. If you want to do justice in this case, and you want to follow His Honor's instructions of proving, making the state prove their case beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt, you will go to the verdict form and check off count 1. We, the jury, find as follows to the defendant: not guilty. We, the jury, on count 2, find the defendant not guilty. You may think he might be involved. That's not enough. If you waver and vacillate, that's what reasonable doubt is all about. You want to make sure the justice system stays intact. There is only one just verdict based upon the evidence they present. And that is, state, we just can't rely upon this beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt, because there is a lack of evidence, there is a conflict in the evidence, and the evidence itself and the investigation itself stinks. I'd use another word, but I would probably get held in contempt. But I think you know what it is. So say we all.
Counsel, thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to take a short recess. The case is not being turned over to deliberations at this time, and remember the admonition, you are not to discuss the case, don't form any opinion about the case, don't allow anyone to discuss the case in your presence, or no research, just leave your notepads and your jury instructions on your chairs, please. Thank you. record reflect the very close figures. Councilman Manuel the defendant. Need a restroom break? Yes, can we arrange that for Mr. Devon?
Thank you. May I discuss?
Anything to discuss? No? All right, we're in recess. Thank you.
This is the great investigation. This is what they want you to do in order to render a verdict that could take him.
Suggestion.
Properly signed.
Over. Proceed.
And tell him that he's going to live life in the state penitentiary without parole or be on death row. This is the investigation they want you to rely upon and say it's proof beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt.
For the ones finding new ways to ensure the job always gets done. For the ones wearing many hats. For the ones who are hands-on, even from far away. And the ones keeping business moving forward. We are Grainger, offering professional-grade industrial supplies, plus real-time product availability and access to experts ready to answer your toughest questions.
You watched it. It showed, I suggest, nothing probative to implicate this young man in it. But we learned, not from him, but from Moretti, that he doesn't go to the drugstore on Miramar Parkway to check their surveillance tape. He doesn't go to Applebee's to check their surveillance tape. He doesn't go to Polo Tropical or the gas station or the bank on Miramar Parkway to check their surveillance tapes. When the car's on 184th Avenue, he doesn't go to the fire station to check their tapes, surveillance tapes. Doesn't go back to the two elementary schools, Sunset Lakes and West Broward Elementary, to check their surveillance tape because he knows it all. He knows it. How do you know it if you don't check? How do you know something unless you investigate? We don't have to do a thing, folks. We don't have to do anything except show up. And begrudgingly, we did. Where the Montessori school was, on Pines, there was a tractor supply company and another school. Why don't you get that? And come in here and say, you know what, folks? We checked all of this. Instead, what they do is take a helicopter ride 4 or 5 years later. And we have to sit here and watch as they fly the route. And we have to watch how they drive the route. Not checking what the traffic conditions were that day, back 4 or 5 years ago. Not checking what the weather was 5 years ago in October 26th. What's the purpose of that? Just to add more of what I suggest is a smokescreen. To look at all this and say, heck, man, 100 exhibits, 500 photographs out of a cell phone, all these text messages. What does it mean? Hopefully, for the state, you'll say, hey, where there's smoke, there must be fire. And say,
all right, we're going to have to jump out of this to take another quick break, but we don't want you to miss another moment, so we'll be back in a quick moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to Law and Crime. A lot going on in closing arguments today for the Ynw Melly murder trial. So let's talk about it. We still have criminal defense attorney and host of the Defense Diaries podcast, Bob Mata, as well as retired judge and prosecutor and now criminal defense attorney Fanon Rucker with me. And Fanon, earlier, the state emphasized to the jury that the motive behind the murders were animosity among the victims. However, the defense has maintained all were friends, and even that surveillance footage of them leaving the studio does show tension among the four men. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, motive is not required to be shown in order to establish the elements of the offense. It helps the state to establish a motive. I don't know that, animosity among friends is a sufficient motive, particularly where the suggestion is that these are close friends and have been for a very long time. So what surveillance shows and what text may show about some conflict, I don't know that it's enough to bear that heavy burden, that heavy scale to establish proof beyond a reasonable doubt that he, in fact, committed these murders.
Bob, what did you make of that?
I agree with the judge. And frankly, I think that the state has really mixed their messages here. They talk about the animosity amongst friends, but they also have this narrative that it was an initiation into the Bloods, that it was something that he had to do in order to become an official member of the Bloods. So, that they're kind of trying to push two narratives there and hoping that one of them sticks. I think that could be problematic down the road.
Fanon, what did you think about the defense attorney saying that the state threatened witnesses to testify? During the state's closing, Christine Bradley mentioned that witness Felicia Holmes hates her, but it's her job to prosecute cases.
Yeah, as a former prosecutor and I occasionally do defense, I'm very
I'm ready to proceed.
Yes, Your Honor.
How about you, Mr. So
Yes.
all set, guys?
Yes, sir.
All right, let's bring the jury. His counsel, the assistant state attorneys, as well as the ladies and gentlemen of the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the state's opportunity to address you, to be referred to as a rebuttal argument. Please give counsel the same courtesy and attention you previously displayed. Mr. Riley, you may proceed.
Ladies and gentlemen, you've heard an hour and 10 minutes of speculation. You've heard an hour and 10 minutes of asking the state to do something I'm not allowed. I'm not allowed to testify. I'm not a witness. So why the personal attacks on me? Why getting upset when there's a mistake that was caught? Just like defense counsel made a mistake and Miss Liberty quickly brought it to his attention that he said the wrong person in Redmond's division. There's a reason why there are multiple layers in place, why there are piece after piece of evidence that shows this defendant did that. Let me start in the back seat of that Jeep. How do we know the defendant was the one there with that Apple iPhone, not that LG? Well, here's a pretty good clue. That's an Apple phone charger going to the back seat right there, not an LG. And also, ladies and gentlemen, you know that LG phone wasn't working on October 26th of 2018. Multiple witnesses testified that it was an inoperable cell phone. So let's be very clear on that. Let's talk about Adrian Davis. AD. Adrian Davis seems to be a part of this puzzle. Kind of looks like the other puzzle pieces, kind of looks like it might fit. But then when you put all the puzzle pieces together and you start looking and comparing it, you go, well, none of the other ones are bright red like that. It kind of sticks out like a red herring. Because that's what Adrian Davis is. So why would counsel ask me why I wouldn't call him? That assumes the witness is credible. That assumes the witness is telling the truth. That assumes that Adrian Davis's testimony is consistent with every other sworn statement, deposition, and trial testimony in this case. If the witness is not credible and doesn't agree with any other piece of evidence in the case, I'm not going to call him. So, counsel made a very, very big deal about the key, right? And why changing cars is going to the same place. Well, here's a message from September of 2018 between Mr. Demmons and Anthony Williams. Is the back door unlocked? Yeah. Well, it gets better. What about this one, where Mr. Demmons is asking, oh, does Bort have the garage button? More than one way to get into a house. And even better, from Anthony Williams, October 3rd, I would have told AD to leave his key. This is all in the messages that are in evidence. So that is on page 248 of the conversations between Mr. Williams and Mr. Demmons. October 3rd, 2018. Tell AD to give you the key. Adrian Davis had a key. There's no question based on these messages. If you're going to make the argument, know the evidence. Because that is clearly contrary to all of the evidence on that. So, that's that community phone everybody used on that. I agree that the 9807 phone is accurate because it doesn't have any emotions, feelings, can't be paid off, it can't be in any way, shape, or form changed. It is what it is. So, to make sure that we're clear on all the aspects of the jury instructions, and Ms. Smith, I'm going to kind of to turn that on. Does the witness's testimony agree with the other testimony or evidence in the case? Counsel wants you to look at each piece of evidence individually. The problem is it's not an individual picture. It's the totality of the circumstances. Because if you look at each individual piece of evidence, what are the odds? Ask that question. What are the odds that Mr. Demmons got into that back seat? That all the fatal shots came from that back seat? That they then go to his friend's house, Frito Bang? You saw the picture, it states 62, they're hanging out. What are the odds that each and every single piece of evidence is stacked up trying to implicate him? And let's be very clear, there are attacks on Detective Moretti on that. Asking he's trying to better himself or further himself. Detective Moretti testified he's a detective in the Homicide Bureau today, just as he was 5 years ago when this case occurred. To say that a man who spent 20 years in armed services in protection and furtherance of his country cares about publicity? There was no impeachment. There was no articles or news things on that. No, Detective Moretti is here fighting on behalf of Christopher Thomas and Anthony Williams, the two young men, kids, that were murdered. And let's be clear, calling someone a kid anything like that, is a play on your sympathy. And ladies and gentlemen, you agreed when we sat down for jury selection that sympathy would not come into play. That you would look and base this on the facts and the evidence. And ladies and gentlemen, I submit to you, you have that. Let's talk about some of the suspects quickly. First of all, they bring up that Danny Polo mentions that and taught you that what does on a plate mean. So let's be clear, Danny Polo is good to tell you and teach you that term, but when he says fire, you're not supposed to believe him. Which is it? You either believe or disbelieve. Danny Polo is a detective with tons of experience in this particular area. He talked about listening to wiretaps, reading all of these communications. They were talking about a gun. It's very clear from the context. But so then let's look at that on the plate comment. When did that happen in those messages? February 6th of 2019. So not anywhere near the date of incident. Again, another red herring to try and say, oh, this doesn't fit. And ladies and gentlemen, having a motive does not equal guilt. Having a motive does not equal guilt. One singular online statement is not the same as having the reasons and the opportunity and the means to commit this crime. And the only person who had the opportunity, the reason, and the means is this defendant. So counsel kept saying the presumption of innocence. That's gone. Once the evidence is there as to each element of the offense, there is no longer a presumption of innocence. Again, in jury selection, we talked about that. If it's illegal to have a certain colored pen on a certain day in this courtroom. Silly example, but a good point. It doesn't matter what color my shoes were or what jacket I had on. It's the elements of the crime, and only as to the elements that the state has to prove. And it's only beyond a reasonable doubt. As we discussed, beyond a reasonable doubt is not all possible doubt. We talked about this. We discussed this at length. That as a juror, if you had 100% positivity as to what happened, you'd be up there on the witness stand. There will always be questions. That's why it's what the puzzle shows. If you believe, and I submit that you should, the evidence from the testimony and the witnesses in this case, there is no question as to what that picture shows. That this defendant committed 2 counts of first-degree murder. So one of the things I want to make sure that you understand, ladies and gentlemen, is you will have the opportunity, because this has been many, many days. If you want to hear testimony read back to you, you're allowed. You don't get copies of the transcripts, but you can request any witness's testimony to be read back to you. Look at Adrian Davis's. Not once did he mention anything about a pee break. Never came up. If there was a reason, he could have testified to it. Where? When? No details. I can't even call him the one fact witness because what he's saying is not a fact. Because there is complete dispute as to what he's saying. So, counsel says that, oh, Detective, now Sergeant Chris Williams, was brought in just to pin it on this guy. No, ladies and gentlemen. Look at your notes. Think back to his testimony. What did Sergeant Williams say? Prove or disprove it was a drive-by. Not who was holding the gun outside the car, how far away. There was no testimony as to that. The testimony was what happened inside the car, what happened outside the car. And if there's no dispute that a murder happened, 2 murders, Why all the cross-examination on meaningless details? Why? Ask that. So, again, we've talked about the phones, and even the defense counsel says the phones are reliable. They're that digital leash that we talked about, that you go back for when you forget it. And there's no evidence whatsoever that supports this, oh, the phone was left in the car theory. There's none. Phones don't send messages and walk 1,300 steps by themselves. There's no evidence whatsoever that anybody else got in that Jeep. What the evidence does show, the defendant was consistently in that Jeep, and that Jeep never stopped during that whole course of travel until it got to the edge of the Everglades. The edge of the Everglades, where there's no witnesses, where there's no cameras, where they can stage a crime scene to try and get away with murder. So, counsel talks about the verdict form. So, you're very... There are options on the verdict form. Including a lesser included offense. What does a lesser included offense mean? A lesser included offense is the smaller felonies that make up murder in the first degree. So in this case, the lesser included offense would be manslaughter. That, as you learn from reading the instructions, is without the premeditation. That is negligently playing with a firearm and shooting someone in the back of the head. That's not what you have in this case, ladies and gentlemen. You have a planned execution of Anthony Williams, and then the same as to Christopher Thomas. Reasonable doubt is just that. It has to be reasonable. It's not beyond all possible doubt. It is one that has to, you have a gut feeling that the defendant is guilty. You are not there on a search for doubt. That's not your job. You are to evaluate the evidence and determine whether or not the defendant is guilty in accord with the law. So, to go to that, and I'm stealing this from Mr. Howard's opening statement, jury service is not a group project. It is 12 individual opinions. So if you have been convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant is guilty of first-degree murder, you don't have to acquiesce to a lesser. If one person is not following the law and is not upholding their jury service, one person saying not guilty, that doesn't mean that's a verdict of not guilty. Mr. Adelstein answered that question for one of y'all during jury selection when he was asking questions. If you have an abiding conviction of guilt, the only appropriate verdict in this case is guilty of first-degree murder on 2 times. So, discussing as to reasonable doubt. We talked about it, about walking to work. Is it possible to walk here from Miramar if you live out there? Possible, but not reasonable. The simplest explanation that makes the most sense, that takes the fewest leaps, is that this defendant killed these 2 individuals. The why? Don't have to prove that. But I've given you options, and the evidence has given you options. So, with regards to Mr. Glass, counsel talked about him. If Mr. Demons is at the house that morning.
Objection to the name.
Demons.
Right.
At the house that morning and rode back with Travion Glass in that red Mitsubishi, why is Travion accusing him of doing it? Why is he saying in these messages, how would they ever think I did something like that? Why, if he was there and saw him now? So defense counsel talked about Brendan Collins. But I want to make sure it's clear for ladies and gentlemen that there's two different types of information. Brendan Collins testified that those other location points can be corroborated with other information. Surveillance video, things like that. So he's saying he's not using them because he's just doing the timing and things. Not that they aren't reliable, not that they aren't accurate, just that that's not what he uses. That was his testimony. In addition, counsel was trying to say that no, things can be changed because of the signal strength and it's things in between the phone and the tower. No, that is on the phone side, not the network side. This is looking at what the network sees when Brendan Collins is testifying. So ladies and gentlemen, you can go and you can compare the various evidence and the exhibits yourself. These will all be sent back with you as you deliberate. And you can look, for example, at the cash report, which is in evidence as State 65, right? This is the 772-713-9807 Demons phone. Well then, ladies and gentlemen, you can also look at what's been admitted into evidence as States 104. The drop pen. And don't take my word or the PowerPoint that I created to say that this works. Do it yourself. Line up the roads and see how everything overlays. Defense counsel says George Bello, his testimony is he can't give you an exact range or distance from that. And that is correct. He said that for a specific gun. However, it's different than what Sergeant Christopher Williams is doing. Because remember, George Bello is doing the internal ballistics of the gun, not the external, not the trajectories and the flight paths. That's not his area. That is separate and apart. Chris Williams is doing that aspect with the trajectories. In terms of all of the information from George Bello, there is still casings that match and projectiles that match on them. Counsel then argued that Kurt Rhodes goes back to the car to get DNA. No. As you heard, ladies and gentlemen, that DNA was collected October 26th of 2018. For the Montessori school, in the route and flying back, counsel says, oh, well, we didn't check traffic and weather. Well, then in the next breath, the argument was, well, that, it's 3 a.m. in the morning, there's nobody out. Just get out on the side of the road and pee. But there's no evidence to that. Look at Adrian Davis's statements. Look at his testimony. He never argued that. So for the search warrant on Jameson Francois, the 3 guns that are missing, the ones that all have the Glock back strap, the Glock, all of that, those aren't involved. And to say that the defense argument that the state or the defense or the detective does not want to find those guns is contrary to all the testimony from Detective Wright. If he didn't want to find the guns, why is he doing search warrants at these locations? If he didn't want to find the murder weapon, why are they diving the C9 canal? Why are they diving the lake behind Frito Bang's house? Of course they're looking for them. When you're looking at and saying, oh, he's a professional. Ladies and gentlemen, the message was very clear where he missed a show to have his hair braided. He told his mom, it's okay. Stop being all upset. To go through a trauma like that, to shoot a video on someone's cell phone, and watch the cell phone video. I'm not talking about the Facebook Live one. I'm talking about the professional. They're using a cell phone to shoot a music video. This investigation went on for 5 years. Every lead was followed. Every warrant was written and then some. The only person every piece of evidence points to is this defendant. Ladies and gentlemen, the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt Jamel Demons has committed 2 counts of first-degree murder. Thank you.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, we're back on your instructions on page 34, 3.13, submitting case to jury. In just a few moments, you will be taken to the jury room by the court deputy. The first thing you should do is choose a foreperson who will preside over your deliberations. The foreperson should see to it that your discussions are carried on in an organized way and that everyone has a fair chance to be heard. It is also the foreperson's job to sign and date the verdict form when all of you have agreed on a verdict and to bring the verdict forms back to the courtroom when you return. During deliberations, jurors must communicate about the case only with one another and only when all jurors are present in the jury room. If a juror goes to the restroom, the deliberation should stop until the juror returns. You are not to communicate with any person outside the jury about this case. Until you have reached a verdict, you must not talk about this case in person or through the telephone, writing, or electronic communication such as a blog, Twitter, email, text message, or any other means. Do not contact anyone to assist you during deliberations. These communication rules apply until I discharge you at the end of the case. If you become aware of any violation of these instructions, or of any other instruction I have given in this case, you must tell me by giving a note to our court deputy. Many of you have cell phones, tablets, laptops, or other electronic devices here in the courtroom. The rules do not allow you to bring your phones or any of those types of electronic devices into the jury room. Kindly leave those devices on your seats where they will be guarded by the court deputy while you deliberate. If you need to communicate with me, send a note to the court deputy. If you have voted, do not disclose the actual vote in the note. If you have a question, I will talk with the attorneys before I answer, so it may take some time. You may continue your deliberations while you wait for my answer. I will answer any question, if I can, in writing or orally here in open court. During the trial, items were received in evidence as exhibits. You may examine whatever exhibits you think will help you in your deliberations. These exhibits will be sent into the jury room with you when you begin to deliberate. In closing, let me remind you that it is important that you follow the law spelled out in these instructions in deciding your verdict. There are no other laws that apply to this case. Even if you do not like the laws that must be applied, you must use them. For more than 2 centuries, we have lived by the Constitution and the law. No juror has the right to violate the rules we all share. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to send into the jury room with you with the verdict forms. There's also going to be a computer which has been you are able to use to see any of the electronic items of evidence that are in evidence. So you'll have that in the jury room with you with the evidence, so you can review it during your deliberations. Also, there may be items of evidence that do not go back if they have a hazardous material on. They're identified as hazardous. They don't go back to the jury room, but if you want to see any of those items of evidence, they'll be here in the courtroom. We have the gloves here in the courtroom, and they'll be shown to you. Just let us know through a note that you want to view an item of evidence that's not back in the jury room, and we'll make arrangements to have it shown to you. All right? At this time, I'm going to ask Ms. Beverly Mayweather and Mr. Patel if you just remain in the courtroom. The other jurors are free to go back to the jury room now. To commence deliberations, you can take your notepads as well as your jury instructions with you, and I'm going to verify with the attorneys that all the evidence is here, and that'll be following the bailiff back into the jury room in a few minutes. All right? Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. You can retire and commence your deliberations. Ms. Mayweather, Mr. Patel, just remain here, please. Let the record reflect the jury stepped out. Counsel remain along with the defendant, and the assistant state attorneys and our 2 alternates, Ms. Mayweather and Mr. Patel. You're not excused. You don't, unfortunately, as an alternate at this time, you're not going to go back in to deliberate. We may or may not need you to come back. We have your information. So you're not being excused. The admonition I gave you previously remains in full force and effect. You are not to discuss the case. Don't form any opinion about the case. Don't allow anyone to discuss the case in your presence. There's certainly no research. There may be things in the media. You're not to look at those things. Just turn it off. All right? We very much appreciate the fact that you're here and willing to serve. But at this juncture, you're not excused. We'll hold your notepads here, and we're going to contact you if need be. All right, ladies and gentlemen? All right. Could you escort them out? Thank you.
Yes.
Just give your notepads to the bailiff, please, and she can secure those. Thank you. All right, let the record reflect the 2 alternates who now also have been excused from the courtroom. Counsel remain along with the defendant. Anything to discuss, counsel?
No, sir.
Mr. Devins? You need the restroom? You're more than welcome to use the restroom. We'll arrange for that. You like how everything went? The presentation your attorneys made? Satisfied? All right. Thank you.
We're not going to vote.
You're not going to be here, so you won't come back.
Are we going to move
They don't go over to 5.
Well, he'll be right downstairs if you need him. All right, so right now, we're going to be in recess. Can you stick around? Yes. Talk off the record.
Okay, he wants to stay. If you bring it back in.
Well, let him go for a restroom break now.
Yeah.
Range or distance from them. And that is correct. He said that for a specific gun. However, it's different than what Sergeant Christopher Williams is doing. Because remember, George Bello is doing the internal ballistics of the gun. Not external, not the trajectories and the flight paths. That's not his area. That is separate and apart. Chris Williams is doing that aspect with the trajectories. In terms of all of the information from George Bello, there is still casings that match and projectiles that match on them. Counsel then argued that Kurt Rhodes goes back to the car to get DNA. No. As you heard, ladies and gentlemen, that DNA was collected October 26th of 2018. For the Montessori school, in the route and flying out, counsel says, oh, well, we didn't check traffic and weather. Well, then in the next breath, the argument was, well, but, it's 3 a.m. in the morning, there's nobody out. Just get out on the side of the road and beat. But there's no evidence to that. Look at Adrian Davis's statements. Look at his testimony. He never argued that. So for the search warrant on Jamison Francois, the 3 guns that are missing, the ones that all have the Glock backstrap, the Glock, all of that, those aren't involved. And to say that the defense argument that the state or the defense or the detective does not want to find those guns is contrary to all the testimony from Detective Wright. If he didn't want to find the guns, why is he doing search warrants at these locations? If he didn't want to find the murder weapon, why are they diving the C9 canal? Why are they diving the lake behind Frito Bang's house? Of course they're looking for them. When you're looking at and saying, oh, he's a professional. Ladies and gentlemen, the message was very clear where he missed a show to have his hair braided. He told his mom, it's okay. Stop being all upset. To go through a trauma like that, to shoot a video on someone's cell phone, and watch the cell phone video. I'm not talking about the Facebook Live one. I'm talking about the professional. They're using a cell phone to shoot a music video. This investigation went on for 5 years. Every lead was followed. Every warrant was written and then some. The only person every piece of evidence points to is this defendant. Ladies and gentlemen, the state has proven beyond a reasonable doubt, Jamel Demons has committed 2 counts of first-degree murder.
Okay, we have to take a quick break here at Long Crime, but stay tuned where we are covering the closing arguments in the Ynw Melly trial in Florida. Stay tuned.
those empty calories just leave you feeling empty. This summer, treat yourself to the Extreme Watermelon Smoothie, made with a watermelon juice blend, coconut water, and sweetened strawberries. Only at Smoothie King.
Okay, welcome back to the Law and Crime Network. I'm Imran Ansari, and the prosecution just wrapped up their rebuttal arguments in the Ynw Melly trial. We're going to be recapping some of the other arguments, the defense arguments, and also the prosecution's arguments later in the show. But let's bring in my guest right now, Nima Rahmani in Los Angeles, California. Nima is a former federal prosecutor, and based on that, Nima, I want to get your opinion about how the prosecution did in connecting the dots in a circumstantial case. It's not often, or sometimes you get that direct evidence as a prosecutor, but more often than not, you're sort of building a case and connecting the dots in a circumstantial case. This was a largely circumstantial case. Prosecution had that burden. What do you think? Did they tie all those things together in their summation?
I think they did, Imran, but their style and their substance. I think from a substance perspective, you have enough to put Melly away for murder. It's going to be a question of does he get the death penalty or not if the prosecution is able to get to that penalty phase. Talking about the style, I mean, here you have, multiple murder victims. I would like to see some more passion. I would like to see the prosecutor be aggressive. Sometimes as federal prosecutors, you get these complex fraud cases that are boring. This is anything but. And I felt like the state was a little bit on the defense here. I wish she ended stronger because, frankly, at least from my perspective, at least as a former, albeit biased federal prosecutor, I don't think the defense story makes a whole lot of sense. They're hanging their hat on this one alibi witness, whereas, the prosecution's theory, I like their experts, I like the messages, I like all the evidence that really points to one person or two people, Melly and Henry. And I wish the state, which pounded that evidence home a little bit better, instead of just being on the defense. And I understand that defense lawyers can put law enforcement and prosecution on the defense, but I wish the state hadn't fallen into that trap here.
Yeah, Nima, I know what you mean. There's style and substance. When you're a trial attorney, you really need both to be successful. And I'm not Monday morning quarterbacking the prosecutor, but I agree. This was a case that lent itself to a real passionate argument in order to convey that to the jury. Let's shift to the defense. The defense put on a case, bringing one witness to the stand and largely relying on that witness and his testimony in order to sort of extract Ynw Melly from the vehicle when the shooting occurred. Do you think that's going to resonate with that jury? Do you think the defense did a good job in terms of hitting that argument home or that evidence home with the jury in their summation?
I thought the defense did a good job given the evidence that they had. I mean, if you'd asked me before the trial, given you got the video surveillance, you have this ridiculous drive-by story, right? Where the victims are dropped off at the hospital. I thought this was going to be a relatively easy case for the prosecution. So the defense did a good job poking holes. They went after the law enforcement witnesses pretty aggressively. They found this alibi witness. We'll see if the jurors think they're credible. But, one other thing, I mean, the defense sort of planted that seed of, a hung jury or a holdout. And, I was surprised that the prosecution went there during their rebuttal. I mean, you don't want to even give the jurors the notion that, even put that idea in their head that, someone may hold out. You want them to keep deliberating until you get a verdict when you think you have the advantage. I mean, if I'm this prosecutor here, I don't think I'm going to get an acquittal. I think at worst, this is going to be a hung jury. So you don't really want to put that in their minds. But again, I think that the prosecutor was reacting too much to what the defense was doing in its closing.
Yeah, Nima, great analysis there. And we're going to take this opportunity to go take a look at some of those defense closing arguments. Let's go take a look now.
And then we get to the lead detective. Well, before we get to the lead detective, I think I missed someone. Trevion Glass, the individual who got into the red Mitsubishi. The man who is convicted of 2 felonies. Now, why is that important? Because the judge read you an instruction on some of the factors to look at in determining whether or not to believe a witness or not. And he told you that one of the factors to look at is whether or not the witness has been convicted of a crime. Trevion Glass, the state calls as their star witness, basically, to say Melly never got into that red Mitsubishi. And he told you one interesting thing. He said he's got a case pending right now, and he doesn't want to go back to jail. Now, who has the authority to put him in jail? We don't. There's only one person who can put him back in jail. And that's the state of Florida, whether it be through the state attorney's office or the police department. And he miraculously is the only witness that says no one got into the red Mitsubishi from the recording studio. But he doesn't tell you how he gets into Melly's house, because he doesn't have a key. So, what's going on here? What's the story here? And then they call the star witness, the lead detective, Detective Moretti. We know he doesn't look at the surveillance tapes on the various Miramar Parkway and Pines and what have you, because he knows. He's worked the area. He knows that he got 9807, the phone that Melly has used, and you've seen various and a lot of photographs. I think it's Exhibit 115, am I correct? 100, excuse me, 100. And who did they get this phone from? Detective Moretti? Jameson Francois. And certainly you ask him, how long have you had this phone? And he says, I never asked him. How convenient. And he goes and says there was another phone in the vehicle, but it was broken. That's 115? 115. So I can't tell you whose phone that is. Now, we don't have a burden to do anything. If you recall, we asked him to take out the SIM card of this broken phone. And there was a reason for it, to tell you the quality of the investigation. He took out that SIM card, read the serial number from that SIM card, which he had never done until you saw him open his phone in the courtroom. And he agreed that you can take that serial number to T-Mobile, Sprint, and what have you, and determine whose phone is, who is the owner, subscriber, and get a warrant for that phone. You've got warrants on a lot of phones. Get a warrant on this phone if you want to see what it is. Moretti doesn't want to do that because he's afraid it'll ruin the investigation. That's why I put these two phones separate and apart from all this other stuff. Now, the state said to you there was no reason, I think was the exact quote, for the Jeep to stop on the side of the road. I suggest to you that as we have done periodically through this case, the reason was...
Objection, that's not evidence.
Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is argument. Proceed, counsel.
The reason was because he needed a bathroom break, just like you and I did when I raised my hand or stand up. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, if he needed a bathroom break, in the dark highway, and you saw him carry it in his hand.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break here at Law and Crime, but stay tuned. More recapping the closing arguments in the Ynw Melly trial. Stay tuned. Welcome back to Law and Crime, where we have been covering an exciting day in the courtroom down in Broward County, Florida, at the trial of Ynw Melly with summations. Both sides have rested. We are now on verdict watch, but we are recapping some of the closing arguments we saw today. Let's go back and look at a clip of the defense closing arguments, and we'll chat about it on the other side with my guest, Ynw Melly.
He'd leave it on the seat of the car. And we know that the car sped off because there was another car waiting, the red Mitsubishi. You want to know there's no reason? The poor kid had to urinate. And the phone was in the car, but they don't want you to know any of this. That's why we had to call Adrian Davis. But let's stay on Moretti for a little while. Because they execute a search warrant on his house, his apartment, and his storage unit. They find ammunition in there. They find in the storage unit, I think, 3 holsters and gun locks. We don't know what type of guns belong to those holsters. We don't know what type of guns were the gun locks to. All we know is there are 3 guns missing based upon the 3 holsters. And Moretti doesn't even ask where these weapons are.
Okay, so that's a clip of the closing arguments from the defense, Stuart Adelstein, earlier today. Let's bring in my guest, Ynw Melly. Ynw Melly is a former federal prosecutor, great trial attorney, a lot of closing arguments in his past there, so he is the one who can comment on this. Let's talk about that closing argument that we see from Stuart Adelstein for the defense. Now, do you think he hit home the strongest points for the defense? Of course, one witness on the defense case that they're really relying on to extract Ynw Melly from that vehicle. What do you think?
I thought the defense did a good job given what they have. That's that passion. I mean, the jurors want to see a lawyer who believes in his or her argument. That's what we saw there. If you're looking at the actual evidence that Adelstein was talking about, I mean, let's just break it up into 2 parts. The first was glass. If I'm the prosecution and I prosecuted drug cartels and all sorts of criminal organizations, you got to lean into that. You have to say, listen, obviously here's someone that's a convicted felon. I mean, we're talking about a gang-related killing here, but, witnesses can lie, glass may lie, Davis may lie, but the video doesn't lie, and the video shows what it shows. So, I would lean into that, get all that out in direct, don't be on your heels during cross and during closing. And then, we know that defense lawyers, they like to go after law enforcement. This is defense lawyering 101. Put the prosecution on trial, put the sloppy investigation, rush to judgment. I mean, these are the themes we see in a lot of defense cases. And, what I would say there is, again, there's no reason for law enforcement to lie. I mean, the cell phone is there. The story about Melly getting out of the car, urinating, leaving his phone. I mean, that doesn't make any sense.
Yep. Nima, thanks for joining me. We're going to take a quick break here at Long Term. When we come back, more recapping Ynw Melly out of Florida. Stay tuned.
Hi, Phil Swift here. This is Flex Super Glue. Just one single drop virtually welds itself to the surface and can easily lift over 3 tons. Get the new Flex Super Glue because it works.